Gray clouds stretched endlessly across the sky, and puddles clung to every cracked paving stone as Jamie Whitmore, a 23-year-old law student, made his way home from a long shift at the local solicitor's office. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his rucksack and the heavier burden of debt. Ever since his father had passed unexpectedly 2 years ago, life had been a slow-motion collapse. Student loans, unpaid rent, and his mother's growing medical bills loomed over him like storm clouds with no sign of clearing. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Whitmore?" The voice on the other end was clipped, commanding, upper class, unmistakably. "This is Clara Weatherby. I believe we need to talk. It's about your financial situation. Meet me at the Old Bramble Cafe at 7 p.m. tonight." Before Jamie could ask who she was or how she even knew anything about his situation, the call ended. He stared at the screen, confused. Who on earth was Clara Weatherby? That evening, with rain drizzling and doubt swirling in equal measure, Jamie stepped into the candlelit warmth of the cafe. Sitting by the window was a woman who looked like she'd stepped straight out of a portrait in an old manor house. Immaculately dressed, silver hair pinned back, pearls at her throat, and eyes sharp as glass. She didn't waste time. "Jamie," she said evenly, gesturing to the seat opposite. "I know your circumstances. I know about your debts, your mother's condition, even your sister's tuition. I'm offering a solution." He blinked. What sort of solution? Her reply was as outrageous as it was calm. "Marry me." In that moment, Jamie's entire world tilted, and what began as a proposal wrapped in gold quickly unraveled into something far darker. The day of the wedding arrived in cold silence. There were no flowers, no guests, no vows spoken in earnest. Jamie stood in the dimly lit registry office in a charcoal suit that still smelled faintly of the packaging it came in. Clara Weatherby, wrapped in an ivory wool coat and gloves that likely cost more than Jamie's monthly rent, looked calm, emotionless almost, as she signed her name beside his. The only witnesses were her solicitor and a notary who barely glanced at them. When it was done, Clara turned to him and offered a polite smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Whitmore." Jamie tried to return the gesture, but it landed somewhere between a wince and a grimace. He felt like he'd stepped into a play where everyone knew the lines but him. The Weatherby estate sat on the edge of North Yorkshire, just outside Harrogate, a colossal manor house surrounded by ivy-covered stone walls, rose gardens in desperate need of pruning, and a coldness that didn't come from the autumn air alone. As the black car pulled through the iron gates, Jamie couldn't help but feel as though the driveway was swallowing him whole. The house itself was beautiful in a textbook sort of way, symmetrical, grand, and utterly lifeless. When the butler opened the door and he stepped inside, he felt as if he had walked into a mausoleum, not a home. Clara gave him a brief tour, her voice crisp and measured. "This is your room," she said, gesturing toward a lavish guest suite with velvet curtains and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. "We dine at 7 sharp. You're free to do as you please otherwise, but there are parts of the house you needn't concern yourself with." Her eyes lingered on him, cold but deliberate. Jamie nodded, not trusting himself to speak. That first dinner was perhaps the most awkward of his life. They sat at opposite ends of a long mahogany table with 3 courses served by silent staff in crisp uniforms. Jamie barely tasted the food. Clara ate slowly, methodically, sipping wine between delicate bites. "I trust you'll get used to the space," she said, not quite a question. Jamie shrugged. "It's different." Clara gave a wry smile. "You'll learn, or you won't. Either way, you're here." Over the next few days, Jamie tried to adjust, but the estate was a strange kind of prison. Rooms stretched out like museum exhibits, untouched, unlived in. Paintings of ancestors long dead lined the corridors, their eyes following him as he walked. Staff came and went like shadows, heads bowed, avoiding conversation. No one called him by name. No one looked him in the eye. It wasn't long before Jamie began to notice the locked doors, dozens of them scattered across the halls, their brass handles gleaming under the dim sconces. He caught himself pausing outside one in particular, a small study with an ornate door carved with ivy patterns. He tried the handle one evening, more out of curiosity than rebellion. It didn't budge. The staff whispered when they thought he wasn't around. He heard fragments, just enough to unnerve him. Why him? She never chooses without reason. He'll figure it out, they always do. One evening, while aimlessly wandering the library, Jamie noticed something on Clara's desk. A small antique key glinting beneath a stack of papers. His heartbeat quickened. He glanced around. The room was empty. He reached for it and slid it quietly into his pocket. That night, back in his room, Jamie turned the key over in his hand. It was heavy, ice-cold, and intricately crafted. It didn't feel like something meant to open a filing cabinet. The moon hung low, casting a pale glow across the floorboards as he crept through the hallway toward the locked study. Every step felt louder than the last. When he reached the door, he hesitated. Something about it felt final. But he had to know. The key slid in smoothly. With a soft click, the door creaked open. Inside the room was a time capsule. Faded wallpaper, dust-covered shelves, photographs in tarnished frames. On the desk lay a stack of legal documents, old contracts, letters, and among them one that made Jamie's breath hitch. It was a letter from Clara, written in sharp, slanted handwriting addressed to his father. "You destroyed everything," it read. "Your greed cost my family everything we had. My husband died with your lies on his conscience. I will not rest until your bloodline pays the price." Beneath it, a marriage certificate, his name, Clara's, dated weeks before he had ever agreed to the proposal. Jamie felt sick. He barely heard the door creak behind him. "Enjoying yourself?" Clara's voice was smooth but laced with ice. Jamie spun around, heart pounding. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you choose me? Was this all about my father?" Clara stepped into the room, her silhouette sharp in the moonlight. "This isn't your concern," she said. "You're here because I needed you to be. That should be enough." Jamie shook his head. "This isn't a marriage, this is a vendetta." Clara's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Call it what you like, but you signed the papers." He stood his ground. "You've lied to me, manipulated me, and for what? I didn't even know what my father did." "You bear his name," she said coldly, "and that's enough." Later that night, Jamie lay awake, staring at the ornate ceiling. The truth sat in his chest like a stone. He was nothing more than a pawn in a decades-old game he never knew existed, and yet he wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. The morning after unlocking the study, Jamie awoke in a cold sweat, the letter's words still etched in his mind like a brand. "I will not rest until your bloodline pays the price." The revelation clawed at his gut. Clara hadn't chosen him for companionship. She hadn't even chosen him for convenience. She had chosen him for revenge. He was nothing but a vessel, an innocent substitute paying for the sins of a man 6 feet under. But Jamie wasn't his father, and he wouldn't go down quietly. The estate that once seemed like a grand curiosity now felt like a prison dressed in pearls and stone. Every corridor seemed to whisper lies. Every locked door, every portrait, every silence from the staff reeked of secrets. He needed to get out, cleanly, quietly, and with proof. But Clara was sharp, unnervingly so, and he couldn't risk showing his hand too soon. He waited until the weekly grocery delivery arrived, a window of 20 minutes when the estate was slightly less watched. He slipped out to the garden and placed a call to the only person he trusted, his old law school friend, Peter Harding. "I need to know," Jamie said, voice low. "If someone signed a legal contract under coercion or deception, is there a way to challenge it?" There was a pause. Then Peter replied, "Depends on what you've got. Evidence is everything." For the next week, Jamie played the part of dutiful husband. He smiled over lamb chops and nodded politely during Clara's cryptic conversations about legacy and rebuilding what was lost. But when she left the house for charity lunches or estate meetings, he scoured the study. He found more letters. Some were addressed to her late husband, grief-stricken, full of fury. Others were to herself, written like diary entries. And in them, he read the unraveling of a woman consumed by loss. "He took our future, I'll take his son's." That line, repeated more than once, made Jamie's stomach churn. But grief didn't excuse what she was doing now. Beneath the letters, tucked under a false bottom in the desk drawer, he found something else. Recent contracts, shady business dealings, assets moved offshore, company registrations in false names. Clara wasn't just settling old scores. She was rebuilding her fortune on a web of lies, and Jamie's name was being used on some of the forms. That night, while Clara was upstairs taking one of her prolonged lavender-scented baths, Jamie scanned the documents with a portable scanner he'd borrowed from Peter. He saved the files onto an encrypted USB drive and slid it into his sock drawer under a pair of woolen jumpers she never touched. He had proof now, but escape was another matter. He approached the only staff member who'd ever looked him in the eye, Mr. Keating, the estate's butler, a quiet man with a rigid posture and eyes that had seen too much. "You know who she is," Jamie said softly, "and you know what she's done. Help me." Mr. Keating said nothing for a long time. Then, almost in a whisper, "You're not the first, Mr. Whitmore. You're just the first who's asked." That was all Jamie needed, a glimmer of hope. They devised a plan. Jamie would leave under the pretense of visiting his ill mother in London. Keating would cover for him for 48 hours. Enough time to get the evidence to Peter, speak to a solicitor, and file for legal annulment and protection. If Clara noticed his absence, she'd assume it was temporary. She wouldn't expect rebellion from the boy she thought was broken. But Clara noticed everything. On the morning Jamie was due to leave, Clara met him in the breakfast room. She didn't speak right away, just stared at him over her coffee, her eyes calculating. "You've been restless," she said finally. "Is there something you'd like to confess?" Jamie tried to play dumb. "Just cabin fever, I suppose. Thought I'd pop to London for a couple of days. Mom's been unwell." Her gaze didn't waver. "You're not a good liar, Jamie." He set down his spoon. "Neither are you." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, Clara didn't move. Then, with terrifying calm, she stood. "I see," she said. "Then let me be clear. If you walk out that door, you walk into a storm you won't survive. You'll be discredited, disinherited, disgraced. And I'll make sure your family feels every ripple. Do you really think I haven't done this before?" Jamie met her eyes, his voice steady. "Maybe. But this time someone's fighting back." Clara left the room without another word. Jamie didn't wait for her to change her mind. With Keating's nod, he slipped out through the side gate and into the waiting taxi. He made it to London by mid-afternoon, the USB still tucked deep in his coat pocket like a relic. Peter was already waiting at a private legal office. They combed through everything, proof of manipulation, coercion, fraud. Peter shook his head in disbelief. "She's brilliant, but she's slipping. And this," he held up the USB, "is enough to take her down." They filed the petition that evening, but it wasn't over. Back at the estate, Clara made one last move. She transferred nearly all of her assets into temporary holding companies in Jamie's name, then leaked whispers of fraudulent transfers to the media. Within hours, headlines painted Jamie as a con artist, young husband accused in fortune grab from widow heiress. The damage was fast and brutal. Jamie's solicitor acted quickly, providing counter-evidence and a detailed timeline to discredit the claims. It worked, but only just. The scandal rocked the press for weeks. Clara was called to account in court, her web of deceit unraveled, thread by thread. But when the judge ruled, it was definitive. The marriage was annulled, her business empire was dismantled, and Jamie was cleared of wrongdoing. Clara was fined heavily and barred from any future enterprise without court oversight. As she was led from the courtroom, her eyes met Jamie's one last time. Not with hatred, but with something far more devastating: emptiness. Jamie walked out into the cool spring air, his coat whipping in the wind. The clouds above began to part. He had escaped. Not just Clara's estate, but the cage of guilt and obligation that had nearly consumed him. And though the world would never fully forget the scandal, he was free. Free to return to his mother and sister. Free to rebuild his name on his own terms. Free to start again. The courtroom had long since emptied, but Jamie Whitmore remained seated, his palms resting on the polished oak bench as the echo of the judge's gavel faded from memory. It was over. The months of silence, fear, and manipulation had finally given way to justice. Clara Ashford, once the untouchable widow with sharp pearls and sharper secrets, had been exposed in full daylight. The documents he'd uncovered, the testimonies, the threads of deceit carefully stitched together over years, it had all led to this. She had lost not just her case, but her hold over him. And Jamie, who had once entered her grand estate soaked in debt and uncertainty, now walked out with something far more valuable than money: his dignity. Days later, he stood at the wrought iron gates of Ashford Hall one final time. The manor loomed behind him, still as imposing as ever, but no longer a fortress of fear. It was quiet now, its windows blank, the staff gone. Clara, bound by court order and stripped of her fortune, had transferred ownership of the property to him. No legal loopholes, no buried clauses, just one final envelope, handed to him by her solicitor, a single-page letter written in her elegant sloping script. "This place was built on grief," it read. "Perhaps now it can be rebuilt on something better. Use it wisely." For a moment, Jamie had stood there, the paper trembling in his hands, unsure whether to burn it or keep it. In the end, he folded it gently and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't linger in the manor. The rooms, though empty, still carried the weight of secrets. Instead, he sold it quietly, without ceremony, and poured the proceeds into something that had taken root during the chaos, the idea of second chances. In the weeks that followed, Jamie worked alongside his old law professor and friend Peter Harding to establish a legal aid fund, focusing on young people trapped in coercive relationships, financial manipulation, or social disadvantage. He named it the Ashford Initiative, not to honor Clara, but to reframe her name into something that spoke of redemption rather than ruin. The fund offered more than legal advice. It paid for night classes, helped struggling single parents clear minor debts, and sponsored women's shelters in Birmingham, Leeds, and Glasgow. Each case that came through their doors reminded Jamie of how thin the line was between survival and entrapment. A mother too scared to leave because her partner controlled the bank account. A bright student on the verge of quitting university because of a loan shark's threats. A widowed nurse manipulated into signing documents she barely understood. Jamie didn't see them as clients, he saw them as himself. His own life found a quiet rhythm again. He returned to law school part-time, no longer out of obligation, but with a purpose grounded in lived experience. He didn't wear suits as often, favoring rolled-up sleeves and late nights at the community center, where he tutored teens who didn't yet know how much they mattered. His mother, once pale and fragile in the shadow of mounting medical bills, was now flourishing in a modest but warm flat in Sheffield. His younger sister, bright-eyed and brilliant, had received the scholarship Jamie had anonymously created in her name. She never asked who had made it happen, just hugged him longer that Christmas than she ever had before. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned copper along the paths of Hyde Park, Jamie sat on a wooden bench with a notebook in his lap. The park was peaceful, save for the occasional bark of a dog or a child's laughter in the distance. In his jacket pocket rested the same letter Clara had written. He hadn't read it again, but he hadn't thrown it away either. Some scars deserved to be remembered, not to relive the pain, but to recognize the journey through it. He watched a young couple pass by, maybe 19, holding hands with the kind of blind hope that once felt naive to him. But now, something inside softened. He didn't blame them for believing. He envied them for it. Because even after all he'd lived through, he hadn't stopped believing either. Not really, not in love perhaps, but in people's ability to choose differently, to heal, to turn suffering into strength. Later that evening, he walked into a modest brick building nestled between a newsagent and a charity bookshop. The brass plaque outside read, "The Whitmore Foundation for Legal Empowerment." Inside, a girl with a blue hoodie sat nervously filling out forms while a volunteer made her tea. Jamie smiled gently and stepped inside. "You're safe here," he said quietly. The girl looked up uncertain but nodded. That was enough. Before heading to his small office in the back, he passed a wall where framed photographs had begun to collect, not of himself, but of people helped by the fund. A woman holding her first pay slip, a boy holding his acceptance letter to university, a single dad reunited with his son. Stories of survival, not because someone swooped in to save them, but because someone stood beside them and said, "You deserve better, and you're not alone." Jamie stopped at one photograph, a faded one tucked in the corner. It was the estate, Ashford Hall, taken from the hilltop beyond its garden. Clara had once said she wanted it to be her legacy. In a strange way, it was, but not through manipulation or bitterness, through the hands of the man she underestimated and the people he chose to lift up in the ruins she left behind. Outside, the city lights began to twinkle. Jamie opened his laptop, ready to write a grant application for another school bursary. As his fingers hovered over the keyboard, he caught his reflection in the screen. Tired eyes, perhaps, but steadier than ever. He had walked through the fire not just to survive, but to build something new from the ashes. It had been nearly a year since Jamie Whitmore last heard the name Clara Ashford spoken aloud. Her trial had faded from the headlines, her mansion sold and repurposed, and her legacy, once synonymous with scandal, had become just another footnote in the city's history. Jamie hadn't spoken of her since the day she was led from the grand sitting room in handcuffs, her cold gaze lingering on him with one final warning. Revenge isn't so easily undone. He hadn't replied. He hadn't needed to. The silence between them had spoken louder than anything either could have said. So when the envelope arrived, cream-colored and carefully sealed, his breath caught. There was no return address, but he recognized the handwriting instantly. Ornate, precise, deliberate. Clara. For a long moment, he just stared at it, the flaps still unbroken. He was sitting on a park bench just outside the legal aid center he'd helped found, the late spring breeze carrying the scent of cherry blossoms and pavement dust. Children laughed somewhere in the distance and cars hummed lazily past. It should have been an ordinary afternoon, but now the past sat quietly in his lap. He opened the envelope slowly, almost cautiously, as if the weight of its words might spill out and knock the breath from his chest. Inside was a single sheet of fine stationery and her familiar voice, captured not in tone but in rhythm and restraint. "Jamie," it began, "I've had time. Time to think, time to sulk, time to scream at four gray walls until my voice gave out. I don't expect this letter to be welcome, but I need you to understand. What happened between us was never truly about you. It was about Harold, about the betrayal I never recovered from. I thought if I could drag your name through the same dust your father left me in, I might feel less hollow. But revenge is its own prison, and I've been in mine long before I met you." Jamie's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. "You were better than I expected, smarter, kinder, unyielding in ways I hadn't planned for. And even when you saw me for what I was, you didn't retaliate with malice. You acted with decency. You gave me a mirror, Jamie. And though I hated what I saw, it forced me to look. You showed me that forgiveness isn't weakness, but courage, that letting go isn't the same as losing. I wanted you to suffer, and you chose instead to rise." He paused there, overwhelmed by something he hadn't felt in months, a complex ache that wasn't pain exactly, but something more tangled. It was the echo of who Clara had been to him, not just a manipulator or a widow with a grudge, but a person whose grief had festered too long in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, someone who was finally trying to reckon with the wreckage she had created. The letter continued. "I can't undo the damage I've caused. I won't ask for a second chance, but I want you to know this. The estate you sold, the foundation you built, the lives you're changing, I see it. Word travels. You turned my fortress of bitterness into a beacon for people with nowhere else to go. That matters more than I can say. You reclaimed a house built on ghosts and filled it with light. You turned my legacy into something worth remembering." At that, Jamie drew in a shaky breath. A young volunteer from the center walked past, nodding politely, unaware of the war of emotion being waged just behind his calm expression. "You taught me something I never expected to learn in the twilight of my life, that even broken things can be useful, that pain can be a forge, not a finish line. I wish I'd learned it sooner. I wish I'd met you before anger had calloused my heart." The final lines were written in a slightly messier hand, as if rushed or emotionally charged. "I hope you find joy in your work, in your days. I hope you find someone who sees you not for the battles you've survived, but for the peace you carry now. And when you think of me, not often I know, but when you do, I hope it's not with hatred, but with understanding. Thank you for showing me the strength I pretended I didn't need. May you live your life as the man you already are, whole despite it all." There was no signature, no sincerely, no flourish, just space, as though she'd left the door open, not for herself, but for the past to finally rest. Jamie sat in silence for a long time. The paper in his hands felt heavier than it should have, and his thoughts were a blur of memory and meaning. He didn't know if Clara had written the letter from a prison cell, a halfway house, or some distant quiet place where the world no longer cared what her name once meant. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the sincerity that hummed beneath every word. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his blazer next to his chest, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder that people could change, that even those who had done wrong could in their own way find clarity. That forgiveness, offered or received, wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing oneself from the grip of old pain. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the cherry blossoms until a few petals tumbled onto the bench beside him. He smiled, just a little, and stood to go back inside. There were more letters to write, more lives to support, more second chances to hand out. Clara had closed a chapter in her life with that letter, but Jamie's story was far from finished. He had work to do, and now, more than ever, he knew why. Jamie stood on the steps of the community center, the late afternoon sun casting golden light on the plaque newly mounted beside the entrance, the Harold Ashford Fund for Second Chances. A year ago, none of this had seemed possible. Back then, he'd been just a desperate young man, burdened by debt and legacy, caught in a web of someone else's vengeance. But now, with every scholarship granted, with every legal case he took on for someone without a voice, he felt a bit more free, more certain that he was living not just to escape the past, but to rewrite it. The children who once walked past him with uncertainty now waved and called him Mr. Jamie. Parents shook his hand. Lives were shifting because of one decision he made: to stand up, not run, to break the cycle instead of being swallowed by it. And the lesson? Sometimes the pain we inherit isn't our fault, but the way we respond to it is our responsibility. Jamie's story teaches us that even when life drags us into someone else's darkness, we can still choose to bring light. We can turn betrayal into purpose, loss into justice, and wounds into wisdom. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt like life handed you the weight of someone else's mistakes, tell us in the comments. You're not alone. And if you believe in the power of second chances, of redemption, of turning scars into strength, subscribe to soul-stirring stories and never miss a journey that just might mirror your own. Sometimes the most broken hearts build the most beautiful futures.